Cenk, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning and for the first plenary session of the 34th American-Turkish Council Conference. So in our time here with our panelists and experts, all the leading names and outspoken analysts of the Turkey-American relationship, we will be discussing the political and foreign policy landscape of Turkey. So, basically, as you all know, Turkey has been going some uncertain and turbulent times, politically, economically, and also in the foreign policy area. So please welcome my speakers here. And I will start with my left, with Kadir, and asking him, what do you see in the next few months of the domestic policy in Turkey? Please give us some background what happened with the June 7 elections, which didn't which didn't create a coalition or the acting government. So we have a temporary government in Turkey since then. And do you expect the political stalemate to be resolved with the November 1st elections? And what are your overall implications? What are your overall assessment of the situation?
Thank you to ATC for inviting us. I think in the June elections, the Kurdish issue was a wild card, and that will continue to be a wild card in the next elections as well. The fact that HDP was able to pass the threshold played an important role in the current deadlock of the sort of parliamentary numbers and the fact that there couldn't be a coalition government. Of course, it's been past 2 years. Turkey has seen several major political crises with the Gezi Park protests and then December operations, the corruption allegations. On top of it, there was a Kurdish peace process ongoing for a year and a half, 2 years. Those were the broad determinants of the political landscape. So going into the June elections, many people thought that AK Party could still emerge as a single-party government. HDP, whether HDP would be able to pass the threshold was a key debate. And HDP was able to do it, and despite the fact that AK Party was the first party and then got 41% of the votes, it still couldn't form a single-party government. We'll see in the November elections if this dynamic will change. The most important change ever since the June elections has been the restarting the fight between PKK and the state security forces. In that sense, Kurdish peace process seems to be on hold in the refrigerator. And then the government is saying that unless PKK fully pulls out of Turkey and renounces violence inside Turkey, they won't return back to the negotiation table on that front. How will that affect HDP votes? When PKK started the fighting in July, they ended the ceasefire. I think they were hoping that they could mobilize the Kurdish population in the southeast, and they could kind of start a fight between the Kurdish people and the state itself. But Kurdish people have not quite done that. All the operations against PKK did not create a sort of backlash among the Kurdish population. That's a plus for the state. That's a plus potentially for AK Party. But it won't necessarily, you can't necessarily interpret this as sort of Kurdish vote will necessarily go to AK Party. It may still end up going to HDP with potentially 1 or 2 percentage points going down. That may affect AK Party's votes, but that may remain marginal, still making it impossible to form a single power government, because if HDP passes the threshold 44, 45% may still not be enough. And it doesn't seem very likely that the HDP will go below the threshold at this point. And then AK Party seems to be garnering some votes from the MHP, but again, that might remain potentially marginal. So we may end up either with a very close sort of single-party government with numbers just going above 276, not many more, and then we may end up having a coalition between potentially AK Party and CHP or MHP after the elections. But one last thing I want to say about this is the reason they couldn't form a coalition, I think, was unexpected for all parties. And then especially MHP and HDP's stance that they wouldn't form a coalition really locked down the system. And there wasn't a lot of room for CHP and AK Party, and they had different perspectives on what the coalition was supposed to do. So if we get another coalition requirement from the election results in November, then I think it could be likely that AK Party, CHP, or potentially MHP could form a coalition. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kadir.
Thank you.
I hear you saying that we should not expect a very different result from the June 7 elections. The results may be very similar to the one. So let me turn to Deniz Zeyrek, who's the representative of the rriyet newspaper in Ankara. So he's very involved with the domestic politics and the Ankara politics. I would like to ask you, what was the intention of renewed elections if the outcome doesn't look to be very different in November 1st as well? What was the motivation? What was the intention of that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, ATC, for inviting me. It's an honor for me. I think I should continue from that point. There is no concrete change in conditions in Turkish domestic politics, except PKK start terrorizing the country. When we start discussing about the result on conditions, naturally the result will be the same as the elections in 7th of June. For example, according to AK Party members or AK Party voters, PKK attacks may change the position of leftist and secular voters who vote for HDP. They could change their mind and they could vote for CHP. But when I look at the region, I visited some cities in the region, Van, Ağrı, Kars, etc. I saw that the situation is completely different. They are asking about the situation. They have lots of questions why PKK terror starts again, why the government, the state starts operations, why they cut the Kurdish process. And they have different answers by themselves. Some of them says after the elections on 7th of June, the government and AK parties start thinking about leaving HDP under the threshold, and this is the best way to do that. So they thinks that, I mean, voters of HDP in the region and Kurds in the region thinks that that operation and PKK attacks, PKK terror, starts because of that reason. So it might consolidate Kurdish votes to the HDP. When we are waiting for HDP as a nationwide political party, unfortunately we so they become a Kurdish party. So, as a journalist who cover domestic policy in field, I think, yes, HDP going to lose its votes comes from CHP or other socialist parties, etc. But they will consolidate their votes from Kurds in the region or in the big cities. So my expectation is the same. There is going to be a four-party National Assembly. So it is going to be difficult to form a one-party government. So we are going to start talking about AK Party CHP government. In my opinion, AK Party MHP government is a little bit difficult because of the position of leader of MHP. Mr. Bahçeli is very solid on his behavior against Mr. Erdogan. We shouldn't forget about the position of Mr. Erdogan. There is still a critical mind in the nation. I mean, 60% of the nation criticize Mr. Erdogan, and they don't step back when they are in front of the ballot box. So they think about his position. They think about his influence in the politics. They think about Mr. Erdogan's negative manner regarding coalitions. And, you know, in Turkish constitution, our president must be non-partisan, but he behaved like a leader of AK Party. He don't hesitate to show it. So there is an anger in the 60% of the nation who votes for elections. So it's going to be affect the result. In this frame, I can say that there is a process started on 7th of June, and it will probably continue after the 1st of November.
Thank you very much. Ömer, you've been a very close observer of the Kurdish conflict in Turkey for a long time. And no one expected that the Kurdish issue was going to be again a major white card or major element in Turkish politics approaching the November 1st elections. So what happened to Kurdish conflict reignite? And as you may know, the Turkish security forces lost more than 90 soldiers and personnel to the PKK terrorism just in more than 2 months. So the trend is very scary, and it seems that the Kurdish conflict has been just going much more dangerous for the stability of Turkish politics and also the Turkish economy. So I would like to hear your thoughts about it.
Thank you for the question, Cenk, and thanks for inviting me to ATC. I think it's the Kurdish question is the tale of rising expectations in Turkey. When the AKP came to power, it wanted to solve Turkey's most important problem. And indeed, it went a long way in terms of bringing about reforms, mainly in the cultural arena, which allowed the Kurds to speak their language, which allowed the Kurds to watch Kurdish TV, which relaxed some of the restrictions on Kurdish education. And in the meantime, something unexpected happened. There emerged talks between the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan in jail and the Turkish government. No one really expected that to happen because the Turkish position was that we don't negotiate with terrorists and Abdullah Öcalan is a terrorist in jail. So once you had the Turkish government negotiating with the PKK leader in jail, there emerged expectations that Turkey was really at the brink of solving the Kurdish problem. And something inexplicable happened in the last few years. And I think it has a lot to do with the fear that the Kurds now are on the winning side of history in the Middle East. There's a fear that in Iraq, the Kurds have established a state. It is, in fact, the only well-governed part of Iraq. There are questions about corruption, of course, in northern Iraq, in the KRG, but compared to the rest of the country, there's a sense of stability and emerging nationhood in Iraq. Then Syria, you had basically an offshoot of the PKK fighting the radical Islamist elements, ranging from Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra to ISIL. And in Turkey, the PKK, which was negotiating with the Turkish government, was also on the verge of declaring that the Turkish government is ready to talk about decentralization, as they call it, democratic autonomy. So there was a lot of optimism in the air. Yet, in the meantime, there was another question emerging, and that was the question of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's then prime minister wanting to follow basically a path towards the presidency, and not only becoming the president, but also changing the system into a presidential one. And all of a sudden, the Kurdish question in Turkey came to be discussed in the context of Prime Minister Erdogan's presidential ambitions. And among many secularists and progressive, more center-left segments of Turkey, which were not fans of Erdogan, there emerged a fear that the Kurds could cut a deal, could have a kind of Faustian bargain with Erdogan in terms of giving him the presidency and the presidential regime in return for democratic autonomy, in return for something similar to decentralization bordering on federalism. And that's when basically I think the country came to be polarized. The polarization in Turkey today is palpable. It's on the one hand between the supporters of AKP and what I would call the more secularist segments of Turkey, for the lack of a better word. On the other hand, it's between Kurdish nationalists and Turkish nationalists. And the Kurds in this political environment decided to establish their own party and to run for the June elections with their own party, with their own candidates as an independent party. And they managed to, in fact, defeat Erdogan's presidential ambition by winning more than 10% and entering the parliament, by winning by 13%. And that basically broke the deal. There's no longer now a peace process in Turkey. We are back at the war process. And I would say that this presidential ambition of Erdogan and the decision of Selahattin Demirtas to challenge the presidential dream of Erdogan by running his party as an independent party, as a party standing on its own, not basically the way they did run in the previous elections as individual candidates in order to avoid the 10% threshold, frustrated the AKP, frustrated the leadership of AKP. In the meantime, the AKP had expectations that the peace process that had begun with talks with the PKK would lead to a ceasefire, not only a ceasefire, but a demilitarization of the PKK. But the demilitarization of the PKK was conditional on political reforms. And the political reforms that the PKK was expecting since 2012 in the form of a new constitution, decentralization, perhaps something along the lines of democratic autonomy were not happening. So there's a blame game going on in Turkey. The PKK blames the AKP or the voters for HDP. Kurdish nationalists blame the AKP for not delivering on the reforms that were promised to them. Whereas the AKP supporters and the government and the security establishment is blaming the PKK for not demilitarizing, for not holding their end of the bargain. I would add to all this also the complexity of Syria. Kobani was a turning point in terms of the Kurdish votes, the Kurdish vote in Turkey. Kobani was a turning point because in Kobani, the Kurds linked with the PKK, the PYD, which is basically the sister organization of the PKK in Syria, was fighting ISIL. And in the eyes of the whole world, there emerged a sense that Turkey did not want to be part of that war. In the eyes of Turkey, two terrorist organizations were fighting each other. ISIL was fighting the PYD, whereas in the eyes of the West, in the eyes of the United States, the Kurds were basically fighting a very dangerous tribal fundamentalist jihadist terrorist organization, and the Kurds were basically holding their ground, and Turkey needed to help the PYD. A good NATO ally should have helped the PYD because the PYD was basically fighting against an enemy of the West. Turkey did not, and the Kurds also, of course, wanted Turkey to help the PYD. As Turkey did not, the United States decided to help the PYD, and the PYD, and I repeat, an offshoot of the PKK, received military support from the United States. That also became a game changer in terms of Turkey's threat perception. Now the superpower was helping the PYD, an offshoot of the PKK. So the Turkish government, in a way, had a sense of alarm. The Kurds in Turkey realized that the AKP government was not serious about the peace process. Not only it was not serious, it was basically turning a blind eye to ISIL, and there were rumors about Turkey also turning a blind eye to ISIL penetration, the crossing border of jihadists, and in many ways the Kurds were disillusioned. So to conclude, to give a concrete answer to your question, the AKP lost the Kurdish vote. Today, where we are now, you would be hard-pressed to find a significant segment of Kurdish society voting for the AKP. There used to be a time when 40% to 50% of the Kurds used to vote for the AKP because they were hopeful about the peace process. Now, the HDP and Selahattin Demirtas has consolidated the Kurdish vote. So Erdogan has lost the Kurdish vote, but he was not able to win the Turkish nationalists either for ending the peace process because the Turkish nationalists actually blame Erdogan for creating the situation. They say to him, it is under your eyes that the PKK militarized, became so powerful. So Erdogan is in a very tough spot. He has lost the Kurdish vote, which was a significant vote for him. He has also lost a lot of votes from the Turkish nationalists. The MHP is stronger now, and the peace process is no more.
Thank you, Ömer, for your remarks. So please, if you have any reservation or if you have any disagreement, we will have time at the end of the first round, very shortly, to go over that points. But I would like to conclude the first round first. Kemal Hocam, Turkish economy is always a decisive force for the future of Turkish politics. But this time, the Turkish politics is not helping Turkish economy. The Turkish growth slowed down significantly last 2 years, below 3%. And also, the recent figures of Turkey's exports is not very, they don't look very good. So what would you share about the overall state of the Turkish economy, and what is the main reason? I mean, the political stalemate doesn't help the Turkish economy.
Thanks, Cenk, and thanks to ATC as well. I'm delighted that it's becoming a tradition that I get to come here every year. Cenk, I'd like to take you up on the note you made concerning the relationship between politics and economics. I don't particularly like it, but I've been around for a while and seen it with my own eyes that each time politics goes wrong, the Turkish economy goes wrong as well. I lived the 1994 financial economic crisis. I lived the one in 2001. I was actually driving to Koç University to give a lecture there when on the radio I heard our leaders throwing at each other a constitution. At the time, as a political science, it did not mean much to me. But the next day, interest rate had shot up to 1,800, 2,000%. But there has also been times when politics have gone well and the Turkish economy has benefited from it. From the 2001 crisis emerged major structural reforms. I won't go into the details of it, and I wouldn't consider myself competent to do that. But it coincided also with politics in the democratization sense of the word picking up. And what I find even more fascinating is that the two began to reflect itself in Turkish foreign policy in a major way changing and moving towards, time is limited, but towards what they call a soft power, Turkey becoming, or Turkey's foreign policy becoming the policy of a typical soft power. And one aspect of that soft power was Turkey's economic relations, especially with its neighborhood. These are the years when Turkey's foreign trade explodes, hand in hand with exports. But much more interesting, I find, is that we begin to see Turkish foreign direct investment in neighboring countries, in Russia, in Egypt, in Libya, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus as well. So good sign of how politics, economics, foreign policy goes hand in hand. And as Cenk just pointed out, Turkish exports and foreign trade is going down. And it's going down quite significantly. However, why is it going down? Very quickly. I think there are factors that have to do with developments outside Turkey. One of them clearly is the chaos and instability in the neighborhood of Turkey, particularly the Middle East. Has Turkey contributed to it? It's a touchy subject, and it's a big subject that would probably require another panel on its own. How has this cost Turkey, the chaos and instability in Turkey, in the neighborhood? It's Libya, loss of markets there. Egypt, loss of markets there, not to mention, of course, Syria and Iraq as well. But the chaos or the instability to the north of Turkey has also cost Turkish exports. Turkish exports to Russia and Ukraine has significantly diminished. I have the figures if you're interested in it. And I'm still amazed to read in the papers, Deniz, I don't mean to be critical of the Turkish media, praising Turkish-Russian economic relations and its future, while Turkish exports have been falling down significantly. Third is, unfortunately, world trade is slowing down. World trade in the first 2 quarters of this year compared to last has shrunk by 13%. European Union's internal trade, intra-European Union trade, has shrunk by 15%. European Union's external trade, its trade with the external world, has shrunk by 14% compared to the first 2 quarters of 2014. Turkey's exports with the European Union has shrunk by 11%, but watch this one, by the neighborhood, 54%. So what's happening in the neighborhood is deeply impacting on Turkey's economic performance. Where does this leave us, Cenk, in the last 2 minutes? Had Güven Sak been able to join us today, in one of the emails he sent us, he was going to throw into the discussion the notion of the need for a great normalization. And in the spirit of that great normalization, I'd like to argue that if a government emerges from the November election, to me, given the picture I have just drawn with respect to foreign trade, and maybe the way in which foreign trade has become so critical to the Turkish economy, when I was a student at Boğaziçi University, Turkey's foreign trade corresponded to just about 12-13% of its GDP. Today, foreign trade, at least in 2014, corresponded to 50% of Turkey's GDP. If you throw in services, trade in services, that brings you to 59% of the GDP. So, Cenk, the economy is critical, foreign trade is critical to the Turkish economy, but what is more critical is that a stable government emerges from the November elections and goes back to a constructive politics that then may reflect itself in a constructive foreign policy, opening the way for foreign trade. However, the problems around Turkey are not about to go away. Time is limited. The writing on the wall seems to say that Turkey's address is upgrading the customs union.
Thank you, Kemal Hocam. Maybe one small note about the economy is also as Turkey goes through difficult times, the global system is not very helpful. The Fed is expected to raise the interest rate, and the liquidity may be a short hazard in the global economy as well. So that's another factor to look at it. So Joshua, so you worked in Ankara, DC, and you covered Turkey for a long time. And you're a leading voice here on Turkey-US relationship. And how do you see the relationship changing last 10 years that you are involved in this bilateral relationship? How you see that evolving with the changing climate in Turkey?
So first of all, herkese hoş geldiniz. Those of you that don't know me are probably very surprised by what he just said. How can somebody who looks as young as I do be covering Turkey for so long? So I want to assure you, I've been working on Turkey for about 15 years. I look young. But what's interesting is every year on this panel, every year we say the same thing. You know, it's interesting. We live in interesting times. And every year we've had the ATC with this political forum, there's been new crises of some sort. And every year we say, well, we've hit the bottom. Next year, it can't get any worse. We said that with the Gezi Park protests a couple years ago. We said it last year when there were rumors about what Turkey was doing and the disagreements with the U.S. This year, we hopefully say it because of how many elections Turkey has had in terms of having 3 elections within a little bit over a year. And so I think, you know, at a certain point, you have to give up and say, you know what? We can't keep on predicting that things are going to go back to the way they used to be. And as somebody as young as myself saying that, it's very funny in some ways. But I do think this idea that Kemal threw out there about the great normalization is important. What I would simply point out to you, and I think I've said it every year I've come to this forum, Washington is always a little bit behind in many things, but particularly on the U.S.-Turkish relationship. Now, in the past, this was a real disadvantage because Turkey was changing so dynamically, and Turkey was such a powerful player in its own region that many in Washington had not caught up to the reality of what Turkey was. We talked about soft power, we talk about the economic capabilities, we talk about zero problems with neighbors, strategic depth, all these great concepts. And as a result, Turkey was always ahead of the curve. Right now, I think many of you that have come from Turkey are probably feeling very depressed right now, just simply because of the uncertainty. And no matter what happens in the election in November, I predict there'll be another election sooner than the last one, right? Meaning that, you know, it's not going to be another 5-year term. It seems that if there's a coalition government of any sort, and even if the AKP is able to manage a government, a majority government, it's going to be a short-lived one. It will not be like the last 13 years that we've seen under single-party AKP rule. And this scares Turkey, precisely because of the history. Now, from an American point of view, I think that the difficulty we always have is everybody from Turkey assumes that everything in the world is about Turkey at a certain point. This is not unique to Turkey. We think the same thing in Washington. Everybody's pulling their hair out because of Donald Trump right now and saying we can't believe how embarrassing it is to have guests from Turkey and we have to explain the phenomenon called Donald Trump. You sometimes have to say the same thing about your political leaders as well. And I think the interesting thing here to say is that the perceptions are not always reality, but the perceptions drive reality sometimes. And so the very good relations that the U.S. and Turkish governments have been having over the last year, particularly since the summertime, there was a kind of a euphoric reaction in Washington when Turkey decided to officially to come out very strongly against the so-called Islamic State. I think many of us as friends of Turkey had been waiting for a long time for Turkey not just to cooperate. I think the Turkish government was cooperating in many ways that didn't reach the media, but to come out very forcefully. Because those of us that believe in the power of Turkey, not necessarily just your government, but the country and the people, have always known that the solution to anything called the so-called Islamic State might sit where the last true caliphate was, which was in Istanbul, right? And so anybody who calls themselves a caliph at some point in time is trying to take on a legacy of the Ottomans that I think in some ways the Turks have been struggling with since the founding of the Republic in 1923. And so I think as a result, when you ask the question about the U.S.-Turkish relationship and where are we right now, we're in a difficult period. But with crisis comes opportunity, and it's cliche, I understand it, but I think in many ways one of the challenges that we always have every time this year, and as all of our friends of Turkey come together, is how do we encourage the friends of Turkey? Because right now, when you look at most analysts of Turkey, when you look at most people writing about Turkey, it's not like it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, there was nothing that Turkey could do wrong. Turkey was on the upward trajectory. Now Turkey, in some ways, can do no right. No matter what Turkey does with the Syrian refugees and takes in the largest number in the world, no matter what it does with its economic abilities, the crisis around it, the political malice, the political infighting we see between the different parties. Most people in Washington are not paying attention. They don't know the difference between the different parties. All they know is what they read. And if you take the larger regional dynamics, the Iran deal is now on its way. Iran seems to be going in a more positive direction, and Turks are somehow become the bad guys. And I think this is a real kind of outside of reality. Turkey is still a NATO ally. It's still the strongest partner the U.S. has. It doesn't mean that we agree all the time. It doesn't mean that we're always going to see eye to eye on everything. But if we're not able to work out these differences as two of the most vibrant democracies that comes with the Trumps and other parties in Turkey, we're not able to deal with it in a much significant way. So while I think in the short term it's going to be continued instability, I think the U.S.-Turkish relationship has to expand beyond the government to government. It has to go beyond the military to military. And I think that's why each of you sitting in this room is so critical. The business communities, the civil society communities, the educational communities, all of us that care deeply about this relationship, whether because we love about our country in the U.S. or in Turkey, know that this relationship has to grow. When you look at the level of trade between these two countries, it's abysmal, and it does not reflect the strength of our relationship. It doesn't reflect the heritage that we share. So I'll stop right there, my proselytizing, but I do think it's important to at least look at the historical perspective and to at least keep an optimistic view about where we're heading in the U.S.-Turkish relationship in the year ahead.
Thank you, Josh. Please, if you have any disagreement, please keep them for now. We will, before I take questions after the end of the second round, I will give you some time for the points you would like to make. We have, I would like to leave at least 15-20 minutes for the Q&A from the audience, so I would appreciate if you limit your answers in the second round to 3 minutes, so that will be greatly appreciated. So I start with Ömer this time. The evolution of the Turkish foreign policy last 13 years, how you see that playing out in the region? So what are the major risks that Turkey has been facing in the foreign policy area today?
In 3 minutes. Well, I guess the easiest way of looking at how Turkish foreign policy evolved is to divide it between the pre-Arab Spring and post-Arab Spring era. The Arab Spring initially came as a hopeful moment, and Turkey believed that it could actually provide a very useful role model to these democratizing post-authoritarian Arab regimes. In Tunisia, in Egypt, there was a sense that the Muslim Brotherhood was on the rise, and the current party in government, you have to understand, in Turkey, the AKP, comes from the tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Milli Görüş, as we call it, was actually pretty much the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey. But it evolved into a conservative democratic party, and it became a much more reformist, much more moderate party. And in fact, after 9/11, in this period of clash of civilizations, a lot of people in the West called the AKP and Erdogan the model for the Islamic world. And the post-Arab Spring was the time for that model, because a lot of people in the Arab world, especially in the Muslim Brotherhood, used to look at Turkey as that model. Yet what happened was that with Syria, especially with Syria, with the civil war in Syria, and then the autocratic turn in Egypt, this ambition of Turkey to play a role of regional leadership, this idea that Turkey could become a country that projects soft power, a political model, turned into a dream. And in many ways, I think Syria was the turning point. Turkey's miscalculation, together with many other countries, that in Syria there would be a quick regime change and that the Muslim Brotherhood, just like in Egypt, just like in Tunisia, would come to power in Syria, became fantasy. And Turkey got embroiled into the Syrian civil war with hundreds of thousands of refugees crossing the border. It got frustrated with the United States for not taking a position of leadership. So Turkey's relations with the US also took a hit because of Syria. In Egypt, Turkey basically was very disappointed by the fact that the United States did not call the coup in Egypt a coup. And all of a sudden, Turkey was no longer this country with zero problems with neighbors, but it had problems with all its neighbors. The joke was that it had zero neighbors without problems now. And so I think that's the short answer in 3 minutes to what went wrong in Turkish policy. We often blame Turkey or the kind of ambitious, idealistic tone of Davutoğlu, who is really someone who has studied international relations, who was sometimes called the Henry Kissinger of Turkey in terms of being an academic, coming to power, becoming foreign minister and then prime minister. But unlike Kissinger, I think Davutoğlu is an idealist. He basically wanted regime changes and wanted Turkey to play this outsized role, and at the end of the day, the realities caught up with Turkey, and the reality of Syria is not something we can hold Turkey responsible for. There is a tendency, because Turkey is so polarized today, to hold Turkey responsible for what's going on in Syria. I would disagree. Syria happened independently of what Turkey wanted, but if there's one thing that Davutoğlu or the AKP is guilty of, it's not being realistic enough, not understanding that the conditions have changed and the necessity to adapt to new conditions.
Thank you very much. Kemal Hocam, you do a lot of work on Syrian refugees and their impacts on the Turkish economy. And I believe you are launching a report this week on the subject. What would you share with us?
Yes, thanks for giving me an opportunity to do some propaganda. Tomorrow at Brookings, we are indeed launching a report on Syrian refugees in Turkey, but we will also look at the broader picture as part of an ongoing project examining Syrian displacement in the region. It's a big topic. In 3 minutes, very difficult to elaborate upon. But when the crisis first broke out, following Ömer in his footsteps, there was the expectation that the regime in Syria would not last very long. So Syrian refugees were received with open arms, and, excuse my language, the international community that wanted to help was told to stay away, that Turkey could handle this crisis on its own, with its own resources. However, reality turned to be a very different one, as Ömer pointed out. And today in Turkey, there are officially 2 million registered Syrian refugees. We must add on top of it roughly 240,000 Syrians who are not registered, and comes on top of it Iraqi refugees, some of whom are not registered as well, and then other asylum seekers, individual asylum seekers coming from various parts of the neighborhood mostly, making Turkey today the 4th largest recipient of individual asylum seekers, and the country that has the largest number of refugees on its territory after Jordan, when you include the Palestinians in the picture today. Managing such a large population is, of course, a challenge. And the international community, who at the early stages had proposed assistance, has failed its burden-sharing duties. Protecting refugees is considered in international law as an international duty where solidarity should be expressed. And my explanation of the European refugee crisis that erupted in July is precisely the failure of burden sharing. And burden sharing manifests itself in a number of ways. One is resettlement of refugees. The High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, on many, many occasions begged the international community to take on some of the more difficult cases from Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. That failed. And what began to happen is refugees resettling themselves with the help of human smugglers and the problems that have followed. The second, very quickly, way of assisting is through humanitarian assistance. And the UNHCR has two large budgets to help internally displaced Syrians inside Syria and the ones outside. And the budget for these programs have been underfinanced. This year, when the crisis erupted, UN's budget for these two programs had only been met 37%, whereas back in 2012, it was 67%. In 2013, it was around still 54%. Clearly, there's going to be a rush to make up for this in the resettlement area, as the US government is doing, and also in the humanitarian assistance. But this is not going to be enough, and for Turkey, the greatest challenge now, as the report from SETA, from Kadir's institution also highlights, we try to do that too, there is the tough reality of having to integrate Syrians. This is tough. There is talk of safe havens, safe zones, but it is a dangerous way to go down, bearing in mind what happened in the Balkans.
Thank you. I hear you saying there's going to be a long-term issue that Turkey will be facing in the next decade. Yes. Deniz, so you are coming from Ankara, and people, the Turkey analysts and writers and columnists in DC, Ankara, and other places have some worries about the state of Turkish democracy. The rule of law, freedom of media, freedom of speech. As a journalist, what would you share with us? Do you feel threatened as a journalist? Maybe that's like for what you write or what you think. So would you share? And also, that's very important that you are here today, because just a couple weeks ago, the headquarters of Hürriyet newspaper was raided by a group in Turkey, in Istanbul. So maybe you want to share something with us about that as well.
First of all, I'd like to share our headline today in our front page. Mrs. Işıl Karakaş, Turkish judge, deputy president of European Human Rights Court. She says 15 years ago, the main topic was torture when we talk about Turkish position in the court. But recently, the main topic becomes freedom of media, freedom of expression, because of the recent situation in the country. So I wish I could say, yeah, we feel ourselves as free birds in Turkey, but it's unfortunately won't be true. I mean, we have two problems in the last 1 year. One of them is about the critical articles regarding Mr. Erdogan. And there are more than 130 cases regarding law of libel. So there are some kids, including some kids, there are some citizens of Turkey are in jail because of that law. And we have another problem regarding our articles, our reports on HDP. When we publish a report regarding HDP, or for example, a press briefing of Selahattin Demirtas, the president of HDP, when we publish his words, we are accused of supporting PKK. And Mr. President criticized our group, our owners, our columnists directly. And when he started criticizing our paper, some crowded, some people from AK Party comes to our office building, and they crush our glasses. They tried into the building. They are talking about firing the building, etc. There are another ways to make pressure on us with some media which supports Mr. Erdogan. They publish stories regarding journalist works on Doğan Group or other opposition papers. We are trying to be a mainstream media in Turkey. We are trying to be objective. We are trying to publish every kind of report or articles on our page. But unfortunately, this position is become a reason for the government. I mean, they want to support openly the government, not publish HDP stories and reports, etc. So I can say that, 2 years ago, we could talk about press freedom, but right now, it becomes a safety matter for us. I had two days like nightmares in the office. They came to our office in Istanbul. They came to our printing center in Ankara. They throw stones. They talked about firing the building, etc. So in that atmosphere, it's really difficult to say something which is critical regarding Erdogan or the government, etc. We are trying to continue our policies, to be objective, to report everything in the country. So if you ask, do you feel yourself free in Turkey? It depends on where do you stand up. If you are next to the government, yeah, you can feel yourself as free as birds, but if you are critical, of if you are opposition, it's going to be difficult for you. Let me give you one important example. Hürriyet is the biggest paper and most effective paper in the country. In a ceremony, Mr. Necdet Özel took an award as a retired general staff, chief of general staff. I haven't been invited to that ceremony as a Hürriyet representative. You can imagine what I am trying to say. The biggest paper, the representative of that paper in Ankara, and the presidency. It is forbidden to us to go there and follow that ceremony. It's enough to explain, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Joshua, seeing these problems or concerns about Turkish democracy, do you think there's a major setback for the U.S.-Turkey relationship? Because as these things happen, we saw that İncirlik opening up, and there's a major success for the bilateral relationship. So how does the situation in democracy impact the view of Ankara in Washington, D.C.?
It's depressing to hear this, right? Because I think I've always, and all of us that love Turkey have always seen that Turkey is 2 steps forward or 1 step back. Are we taking 1 step back or is it more step back, right? And I think the challenge that you're describing is not unique to your paper. It strikes me that this has been going on for a while. And I think both sides can argue about why it is and talk about whether journalists are ethical and everything else. But I think, to your point, Cenk, it's depressing because Turkey deserves better. And I think the next generation of Turks are the ones that I have great hope in. When I go to Turkey and I go to the universities and I teach, and when I see the entrepreneurs, when I see the people that probably work in this room and the employees that you have, it's amazing because in some ways people are just trying to get ahead. The politics that are happening up here, whether it's this time or whether it was the 1990s or whether it was during the Cold War, I think there's always been that feeling in Turkey that sometimes the Turkish people and the Turkish nation will have to survive their government. And so I think the challenge that we have in the United States is we have the ability sometimes to be apathetic, to not care. There's always been a disconnect here where Americans don't really think about Turkey until Thanksgiving, and that's the wrong Turkey they're thinking about. And in the Turkey, you think about the U.S. all the time. So every taxi cab driver gives me an expert opinion about international relations everywhere I go in Turkey. And I think that challenge and that disconnect really highlights the big problem, which is that the number of friends and experts who work on Turkey. How many Americans speak Turkish? You have more students coming from Turkey to the US, the largest number of any European nation, as Fulbright and everything else. And so there's a real kind of misbalance that I went back to earlier. And I think the problem is when you hear these types of stories that we just hear and we read about them in the press, it's very easy in some ways to say, well, that's bad, but it's not nearly as bad as Syria. And so as a result, Turkey is always kind of at a different place. And I think the only people that can actually take a hold of their own destiny are the Turks themselves. And when Americans, whether it's the government or others, try to pick sides and we decide to weigh in for one party or the other, we always get in trouble. Our history is constantly filled with trouble. And so my feeling is that, look, I think it's important for America to stand for its values. I think it's important for Americans to use the language that the Turkish government has used themselves. When they say they want the Copenhagen criteria to become an Ankara criteria, we want you to mean it. And when we talk about the freedom of the press, when we talk about human rights, when we talk about the value of democracy, it's not just elections. It's much bigger than that. And I think the challenge that we often have sometimes in Washington is this, what Ömer talked about in kind of the realist and idealist phenomenon. That's not unique to Turkey. We all struggle with that. But at the end of the day, we all are focusing on our own futures. And at the biggest point, how can America be the biggest friend to Turkey? And I think part of it is to be able to reinforce what our historic alliance has been, what the bedrock of that is, and then to not get in a situation when we point one finger at somebody else and therefore looking back at us. Because when we criticize Turkey about the freedom of the press, there are times that you could criticize us about that, or you criticize, kind of double standards about the region. It's very easy to point the finger. And I think in many ways, this government, in particular the U.S. government, the Obama administration, put Turkey as their central feature. He was the first Muslim country that he went to Ankara, and he gave an amazing speech. He gave a lot of amazing speeches about wanting to partner. The question is, do those words and actions line up? And so before I start criticizing the Turkish government, I'll start looking at my own government and understanding what our Turkey policy is, what we're doing on that sense. And I think both sides of the Atlantic, we need to do that. But we need to re-establish that transatlantic link and also think about what the future looks like so we can have a brighter one together.
Thank you, Josh. Coming back to the domestic politics, because that basically determines almost everything that we're talking about, the economy, foreign policy, and everything. So, Kadir, do you think the debates on the presidential systems are over today? You think Erdogan will be insisting on changing the system? Or if, let's say, all the polls show today that there will be 4 parties in the parliament, as Deniz and you also mentioned, and Ömer mentioned earlier. So do you think that we will have a coalition government as like in the parliamentary system, or are we still talking about changing the system to presidential system like next 2-3 years in Turkish politics?
Well, I think the Turkish system has already changed in terms of parliament and president's relationship. If we quickly go back to 2007, the reason we elected president by popular vote was the constitutional crisis in 2007, and the solution back then that wasn't part of a comprehensive plan for the future was that, okay, going forward, let's elect our president by popular vote. And now we have the first popularly elected president with 52% of the votes, but the constitution remains the old constitution, which essentially would deny the civilian authority real power in many ways, especially when it came to critical issues, security issues, etc. So you kind of now have 2 elected heads of government with the prime minister and the president. Their position, what they're supposed to do, their authorities, etc., are not well defined, and we still have 1980 constitution with lots of modifications along the way. So I think the presidential system debate is part of that need for a whole new system that all parties supported all along for the past several decades, and President Erdogan thinks that presidential system is the best way because it's already in many ways semi-presidential system. So I think regardless of the election results, we are going to have to look at the political system and how to arrange the authorities of the prime minister and the president. I think in either single-party government or coalition government, that's going to remain an issue, and that touches upon the issues we talked about the Kurdish issue, etc. What I would like to point out from quite a few things that's been discussed is the fact that I mentioned very briefly, it's been 2 years with serious crises in Turkey, and I think those crises are not just political crises, especially the December operations. The state establishment, I think, felt deeply compromised. The security of the state at the highest levels of the government had been compromised, and this is not an easy thing to get over. It's a deep trauma, and then when you have that, the areas of freedoms and rights they diminish, and that's not a justification for it. That's an observation. And then on top of it, you have the Kurdish issue that's increasingly regionalized. When Ömer discussed the Kurdish peace process, one thing I would like to point out is the fact that PKK over time saw both opportunities and risks, right? Whether AK Party could deliver what they wanted, whatever they wanted, both, in terms of controlling the southeast region, but also politically, Kurdish political movement having a firm grounding in the Turkish political system. Whatever they calculated, they wanted to wait and see the election results, whether AK Party could survive the Gezi, whether it could survive the December operations, whether it could survive the election cycle. So it takes two to tango, and this is an armed military organization which saw opportunities in Syria, which saw opportunities elsewhere. And that brings me also to the US-Turkey relationship. Right now, there's a very serious risk in this relationship, the fact that the US is cooperating and helping PYD while Turkey is seeing it as it's not just Turkey seeing it, actually many Americans admit that fact, that the PKK and PYD are essentially same organizations. This is a serious risk for US-Turkey relationship because PKK continues to threaten Turkey, hasn't pulled out of Turkey. Turkey tried to find ways to, cooperate with Syrian Kurds, even talk to PYD in that sense, but there was no middle ground because of the fact that PKK continues to threaten Turkish security. So this is a serious risk for US-Turkey relationship and Turkish foreign policy for a while at least. Because of the civil wars next door, it will remain securitized in many ways, and that will affect the freedoms and rights in Turkey. It's not a justification for it, but it's kind of what I see ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for the answers of the second round. Now I would like to turn to the audience for questions. Please make sure you keep your questions short and identify yourself and specify who would like to ask the question. Please, gentlemen. I think we need the microphone. It's coming to you.
My name is Murat Erker from Glomtech. I'm an ATC member. So thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. If you take the problem into pieces, so terror problem and Kurdish problem. Terror problem is easy, no problem. But can you describe who is Kurdish? Or is there any exact definition of Kurd when you come to the Kurdish problem? Are they Muslim? Are they Jewish? Are they communist? Are they coming from outer space?
Who would you like to ask her question?
Yeah, it's two.
No, you should choose one because we don't have that much time. So just choose one person.
Maybe Joshua is better then.
I don't know if I should be insulted by that or if I'll take that as a compliment. Look, I think you're asking
I don't
a
mention
question.
it.
Thank you.
Can I go forward?
Just keep it with one question because I would like. We have only 10 minutes left.
It's all connected. So.
Okay, very short, maybe 10 seconds.
So 2 million Barzani Kurds are staying over the biggest oil reserve in the north of Iraq. and fighting against PKK terrorists, and 20 million Kurds spreading over the Turkey and want something undefined. I can understand, even as a former journalist, what they want. And they fight against Turkish forces. So that's it.
All right. The question about the Kurdish identity, I think everyone in this room is a bigger expert than me in some ways, but let me just highlight, I think, some of the obvious points that sometimes maybe just having an outsider say it to you makes more sense. This discussion about Kurdish ethnicness and Turkish ethnicness is a bit, in some ways, it's almost a ridiculous conversation, because from the very beginning of the foundation of the Republic, they have been intermixed. And so the question of kind of, you know, do I feel more Kurdish, do I feel more Turkish? I mean, some of the greatest Turkish leaders of all time have been Kurdish, right? Turgut Özal, I believe, had a Kurdish lineage. And so trying to separate and take out the two when they're so closely connected. And I think the bigger issue here is less about kind of the identity question in Turkey, but the broader question. And this is why your second point is so difficult. If there was a Kurdish state, you know, Ömer talked about the KRG, and I agree with him. It's the most successful entity within Iraq, but it's still not its own foreign entity. Because if that was the case, then all Kurds could go to that one state. They could say, you know what, we want nothing to do with Turkey. We make a choice and we're moving over. But when I look at the polls, the majority, the vast majority of citizens of Turkey who have any Kurdish origin do not want that solution. They would rather be a part of Turkey than they would leaving. And so no matter what happens in Syria, whether there's kind of a Kurdish federation and there's a Kurdish part in Iraq as well, unless there's some major change within Turkey, and if there's a civil war, then all bets are off. But I think the current state that Turkey is in, and particularly going towards a European Union membership, in which you would have to have a discussion about what are the rights of different groups. And you know, when you threw in Jewish there, I'm going to interpret that as the way the Ottoman system basically broke people down by religious groups. And so as a result, the milliyet of kind of the Kurds and the Turks were the same because they're all Muslim in some ways. And so the reawakening of kind of the Kurdish identity that leaves one of the largest group of people in the world without their own state is not a Turkish problem. It's a world problem. And I think as a result, Turkey has to be a part of that solution. And I think in many ways, the conversation we're having about the U.S. involving itself in a domestic issue that is a much larger issue between supporting the Kurds in Syria because they're our best fighters against the ISIS, leads to a major area where it doesn't drive us apart, it drives us closer together. And so that conversation, which I think the HDP is leading towards a more positive direction, to me, if I have to choose between HDP or PKK, it seems obvious. You pick the HDP. It's a political solution, and that's the only solution. You said the terrorism is easy question. I think some of our military friends would disagree, but I do agree with you that you can't have a simple military solution for a political problem.
Thank you. So please, General Jones.
So piggybacking, Josh, on your initial comments, we always gather here, and those of us who've been in the security sector or the commercial sector, really all understand and treasure and value the importance of the Turkish-American relationship. But at the grassroots level in Turkey, which I've watched for over a decade, I'm always astounded to see how a significant portion of the Turkish public doesn't share that same view about the United States. And I've raised this with President Erdogan last year and asked him, what can we do about this? Why is this consistently a big problem? And I'd be very interested in some of your observations, because I think, you know, we can tell ourselves among the elites, if you will, I don't like to use that word, but you know what I'm saying, that this is an important relationship. But unless the public feels that way, we always have this tension. And this is one aspect of it, that going back to my days as Sakir, that I noticed in Turkish press, in poll after poll, that a significant majority of the Turkish public doesn't share that view about the United States. I haven't seen one here in the US about Turkey, but I suspect that poll would be much more favorable than the Turkish polls. Thank you.
I would recommend Deniz answering this question coming from Ankara and sharing the perception.
Honestly, I must say it's not a problem of Turkey. It's a kind of region-wide problem. I mean, United States has problem in public opinion in the region, Middle East, in the different regions. I don't know why, but you have some problem with different nations. So it's not belong to Turks, I think. But you are right. As Turks, we are very familiar with conspiracy theories. So if there is something bad in the country, we always directly look at United States, and we say U.S. is planning that story or things. I mean, I don't know why, but it looks really difficult to change that position. Maybe you are very much involved in the region with your army, with your diplomats or intelligence services. But for example, as Turks, we saw lots of your military persons, intelligence services, etc. But we couldn't see your tourists enough, let's say, or your companies enough. If you try to send your tourists or your companies more than military, it might be affect the situation in Turkish public opinion.
Thank you. So I will take a few more questions if there are any. Are there more questions on the, are there more questions? Because that will be the last round and I will be wrapping up the panel. So, okay, so we have one final question. Please introduce yourself, keep the question short and specify whom you are raising your question to.
Sure. So my name is Shirin Köprücü, and I own my own global business consulting and training firm, Strategic Straits. One comment, I've been noticing one thing. Selahattin Demirtas and we were born in the same city, Elazığ, 1 year apart. He's Kurdish-Turkish citizen, I'm Turkish-Turkish citizen. So it's just been a realization I came to in the past years. My question goes to Dr. Walker. With the way U.S.-Turkish relations are, what do you think small to mid-sized Turkish companies could do to develop more awareness of Turkey and receptiveness to their products and services in the United States? Thank you.
So let me tie this to General Jones' comment, because I just want to echo what he said. I go to Turkey all the time, and I'll sit there listening to my friend wearing Levi's jeans, drinking Coca-Cola at McDonald's, telling me about a Hollywood movie, but telling me how horrible my government is and they'll spew anti-American venom. So I think separating out kind of America, the government and the country. And I think, unfortunately, the one answer I would give you that I think you probably know, it's okay to criticize the U.S. There's no penalty by criticizing the U.S. If anything, it makes you popular. Even Turkish leaders do it, and they do it in Turkish in places like Konya and other places, but then when they speak English, they suddenly don't have the same feeling. And I think to your point about the SMEs, that's the future in my mind, because as Turkey goes through a difficult period of time, the entrepreneurial spirit and kind of the ability that the Turks have doesn't disappear. If anything, when you look at the most entrepreneurial people in the world, they come from places where there's crisis. Look at how many Syrians have done amazing things, Steve Jobs as well quoted, Palestinians, et cetera. So if I'm a small SME business in Turkey, I want my market to be in the largest market in the world that I have access to. That's in the United States. But that also means that every person in this room needs to be helping and focusing on this. It's not just SMEs, it's also women in Turkey. It's also all the different facets that need to be reflected in the diversity of that. Because if you're going to solve the Kurdish problem, if you're going to solve the polarization problem, all boats have to rise. When Turkey's doing well economically, then suddenly all the problems become less. And so I know Cenk wants me to stop right here, so
I will ask if you have like maybe 10, 15 seconds, I may give you 10, 15 seconds if you have any final remarks on any questions that were raised. Please.
I'd like to allow myself the luxury to reflect on General Jones' question. I agree with Deniz, but I think that is one side of the medallion. Before I joined Brookings, I had clocked in 30 years in university, and most of it was at Boğaziçi University, the former Rubber College. We received the top 1% of the 1% from the placement exams. And I taught international relations. I was always amazed how they would come with uncritical minds. 30 years have taught me that the other side of the medallion, for explaining what the question you raised, is that we are a society where critical minds are not encouraged. Critical discussion is not encouraged. So when the going gets tough, fingers are pointed to the outside world. And they can range from the United States to even Lufthansa. I recently published an op-ed at Brookings. I don't use Twitter, but I looked at it, and I was being accused for being a Zionist for what I do. It's easy to do it. And Josh made references to cab drivers. Everybody in Turkey is an expert on international relations, and that expertise is simply based on rumors. And I, through my career, towards the end of it, rather than maturing and becoming a little bit more tolerant on this issue, I've become extremely intolerant, because I find that kind of attitude very arrogant, to think that there are international relations experts, scholars, professors, who write articles, who write books, who do research on Turkey to fill up many rooms of this size, and then you have someone who comes up from a cab, from a coffee. I don't talk down to them, but to think that they have the answer to complex questions just like that has been a very frustrating aspect of my career.
Very short, Kadir. And Ömer, do you have anything to say? Like maybe just keep it to 15 seconds after Kadir, but we need to really wrap up because we are running out of time.
I think conspiracy theories aren't unique to Turkey. I mean, Obama's, being Muslim in this country is also being talked about. But I think I agree with the distinction about the policy and the country, but I have to repeat my earlier remark. U.S. policy has focused on ISIS, right? And then to counter that, it's collaborating with PYD. And this was an age-old conspiracy theory in the Turkish psyche that U.S. wanted to divide up Turkey, was supporting PKK, among other actors as well. But now, when you have these, policies essentially, in the minds of these the common folk confirming this theory, then we have a much harder job. And I don't think it's on that side only, because the U.S. has the luxury to do things and then move on without worrying so much about how it's perceived elsewhere. So I think it's a two-way street. Thank you.
Ömer, just very short.
I mean, what makes Turkey unique in terms of anti-Americanism is perhaps the fact that resentment against the United States is higher in Turkey than in Pakistan, than in Palestinian territories, and than in Egypt, according to Pew Attitude global polls. So one would think, why is it that a NATO ally has such resentment against the United States? Partly it's what Joshua said. You have long lines in front of American embassies for green card applications. Turks want to send their kids to the United States. They don't have a problem with the United States as a brand in terms of education, sending their countries, tourism, etc. But Turkey, perhaps more than Pakistan, more than Palestinian territories, more than Egypt, has an acute identity problem in terms of two issues: Islam and secularism, and Kurdish nationalism versus Turkish nationalism. And you cannot have a conversation in Turkey with any rational Turk, not just cab drivers, but university professors, without talking about the relevance of the United States for the Kurdish problem in terms of US support for PKK. Everyone believes that this is true, that the United States wants to create a Kurdish state, and the fact that the United States now is helping the PYD gives credence to the conspiracy theories. The second one is the fact that the United States has supported moderate Islam, and that the United States has basically allowed someone like Tayyip Erdogan to come to power, or has given home to Fethullah Gülen. Therefore, there is this perception that both on the Islam versus secularism front, or Turkish nationalism versus Kurdish nationalism, the US is relevant. And this is about who we are as Turks, our identity problem, and our inability to tackle these problems without references to the United States. It is, as long as Turkey will have an identity problem, I would venture to say it will have high resentment against the United States, because it has a tendency to blame external factors.
Please join me thanking my panelists for this panel.